in the relationship with Elizabeth Warren, and which I think, probably culminated in some level on the debate stage. I can't remember which debate it was.
Iowa in January, I believe.
Iowa in January. And what's your perspective? What was your perspective, or what was the campaign's perspective going into it? And how did that change over the course of the campaign? And what is your perspective on it in retrospect?
Sure. There was a real divide on the campaign going in about whether she would be a strong candidate or a weak candidate. Bernie, interestingly, looking back in retrospect to everything that happened, always thought and always kind of scolded people who thought she would be a weak candidate. Always said she's a strong candidate, she's really smart, and she has the ability to win this race. And if she does win this race, she can win. He thought he was a better candidate, no doubt. But he always, when other staff would kind of point out her weaknesses, he was always very like, no, stop. Like you're really underestimating her. And, what we saw is she launched her campaign in late December. We had a very clear system for tracking almost on a day-to-day basis other candidates' online fundraising, especially at points where ActBlue was releasing a lot of data. So we were able to quickly see that her opening fundraising wasn't very good. It was a few $100,000, which that well below expectations, didn't show much momentum. She was coming off the very bad video she put out on the Native American issue, et cetera. We launched the campaign, but the thing we realized going back even a year before that, there was a meeting in my apartment where we met with Bernie before he decided to run. He was kind of resistant to even doing the meeting, but we're like, we need to start thinking about this, where we started developing strategy. And one of the things our research showed us was Bernie and Warren weren't the Venn diagram of voters that kind of was covered. Bernie Biden was a huge Venn diagram. Warren was a more Venn diagram. Our voters, basically, her voters were wealthier, had better education. Our voters, lower education, less wealthy, more people of color actually in our voter group, especially Latinos. And our voters and Joe Biden's voters looked much closer than Elizabeth Warren's voters and our voters. And so we were kind of going for two different groups in a way. And a lot of the campaign that allowed us to completely remain almost as allies. If you remember the Detroit debate, they kind of stood there and just took arrows and just like buck them off from everybody on their policies. I think in terms of strategy, in terms of the development, I think there are a few key moments I address in the book. One is right post heart attack is a really intriguing moment for us because the day we had the heart attack that week, Warren goes ahead of Joe Biden for a very brief period in the polling. And Bernie slips to fourth place in Iowa behind Biden, Warren, Buttigieg, behind Biden, Warren, and Buttigieg, according to the Des Moines Register, that like gold standard ancestor poll. At that point, we were supposed to go up on air with basically $1 million a week in advertising in Iowa. We paused it because of the heart attack, but the next week we were right back on air. And we're sitting there, and the only three candidates who really have money to go on TV are Warren, Bernie, and Buttigieg. Buttigieg is up on TV, but he's in a completely different kind of voter set. Warren doesn't go up on TV. And we're kind of waiting for her to go up on TV because while our voters don't overlap, if she grows, there would be calls in the national media for Bernie to like step back for her. We were kind of more worried about a narrative issue than a voter issue. It would cap us at growing because if she was growing, there'd be a narrative, oh, Bernie's done, Warren's right in. And one of the ways you do that is you kind of solidify yourself in Iowa. And as we're advertising at this heavy pace, our votes, like we're heading straight up. She's kind of flat and headed down, both nationally and in Iowa. And we're watching this and we're like, when is she going on TV? When is she going on TV? And she wasn't. And I frankly think that was a bad strategic choice on her campaign's part that frankly gave us a window to catch up. Then you get to kind of the Medicare for all moment where Warren decides in November to adjust her position on Medicare for all. Her people would say improve. I go through in the book our strategy, which was built from 2017 for exactly this moment, where we basically created a strategy around Medicare for all, where we wanted as many people who were potentially running to sign on to the bill as possible, including Elizabeth Warren, who for a long time we were worried wasn't going to sign on to the bill. And I go into this in the book about that dynamic between Bernie and Warren and our fear that she wasn't going to sign on to the bill. But once you signed on, you were kind of committed to the bill. And what we realized is, based on something, frankly, Grover Norquist once told me. I know that's a weird. This is. I went to the J Street dinner, and Grover
Former head of Club for Growth.
The Americans for Tax Reform.
Oh, Americans for Tax. Oh, okay.
The principal conservative activist behind being the tax pledge was his big thing. And he was at the J Street dinner, and I was seated next to him. And the first thing he did, it's one of those Washington dinners where they put the dessert in front of you on the table before the meal. And he sits down, he grabs the dessert, and he starts eating it. And I'm like, you eat the dessert? And he's like, what if there's a fire alarm there? And then I don't get dessert? It's like, that's actually a good point from Grover Norquist. I appreciate that. But the strategic point was, I started quizzing him on the tax pledge, which, became religion in the Republican Party. I will not raise taxes ever. And I was like, how do you enforce that? And he was like, it's self-enforcing. Once you sign, if you violate it, the activists are going to kill you. I get to raise all the money and I don't have to spend $1 enforcing it. Medicare for all, same concept. Once you sign, the Medicare for all activist community will be the enforcers. And the one of the things that, by the way, they were most strict about on the activist side was the implementation period. And that's what Elizabeth Warren touched. And you touch that rail with those activists, they're going to go nuts. And I think she expressed anger eventually that activists were really beating her up, blaming our campaign for it. But frankly, we didn't direct that. But we didn't direct that. We knew it would happen if you did it. But we don't control those activists. And those activists, frankly, had protested Bernie at times for not being good enough on it. And I think doing that, making those changes late in the campaign really did hurt her. And then you get to the night you're talking about, the debate night, where before the debate, their campaign, because certainly there were 3 people in the room who witnessed this conversation, and certainly our campaign didn't leak it to CNN. There's a story on CNN that 4 sources, which is always interesting because there were 3 people in the room, one of which clearly wasn't a source. 4 sources say Bernie said that a woman can't be president during a meeting with Elizabeth Warren. I think, that exploded on the debate stage. Honestly, it was an interesting part of the book to write because I had to put it in, right? I had to write about it. I couldn't skip that part. It's a very difficult part to write because I want to express my opinion, which I do wholeheartedly, but you want to see the moment for what it is. And in my opinion, which is in the book very clearly, I had been with Bernie for 1,000 meals. I've heard his opinions on everything. I've heard his opinion on Elizabeth Warren. I've heard his opinion on Donald Trump. I've definitely heard his opinion on what it takes in 2020. And I've heard his opinions on different candidates. Can they win? Should they win? I never heard anything like that. Yeah. In fact, I constantly heard the opposite, which was Elizabeth Warren's a strong candidate who I think I'm a better candidate for a number of reasons, but I think she's a strong candidate. I think she can do very well in this race. So it was shocking to me. And look, who knows what happened? As I said, there were 3 people in the room, and people can have very different interpretations of conversations. So I don't necessarily think anybody is quote unquote lying. I do think I just had never heard Bernie say anything like that, nor do I believe he believed that. Yeah.
Well, let's put aside the question of whether he said it or not. Okay. Right. I mean, as a political matter, right? Yeah. I mean, because this is being deployed as a political matter. It's either true or it's not. My guess is maybe somebody said something and somebody heard it in a different way. Whatever. It doesn't really matter. The question is from a political, in terms of its deployment politically. Yeah. What do you think they were trying to achieve, and what were you guys feeling afterwards? Because from my perspective at the time, and I was, obviously I was supportive of Bernie, and I wanted Bernie to win, but I definitely was supportive in some sense of Elizabeth Warren, not necessarily, winning this race, but in general, I was disappointed by the sort of like the way that she did politics, because I feel like this was a missed opportunity for her in the way that she responded to that CNN story, which could have been, I'm not going to talk about what I discuss in a private meeting with an ally.
That
And
CNN story was, that CNN story was probably her camp.
Well, no, definitely. Whether it was her camp or not, she had an opportunity to respond that way. You know, very often your camp will say one thing and you as a candidate will say another. She could have had the opportunity to say, I'm going to have my cake and eat it too.
I don't know what I can't speak to their strategy. I can tell you what it did. I think the first thing that it did was it really balkanized Bernie and Elizabeth Warren supporters, because while there was no Venn diagram if they were in the race, if one had left the race, there was certainly a look on certain portions of their candidates to the other side. What you saw after, because we were polling second choice, because Iowa in the caucuses, if you don't reach threshold, you get second choice. So we were polling second choice, and you saw the second choice votes on both of those sides just plummet. You saw Bernie's support among women decrease. You saw some other dynamics take place, and I think you saw that was kind of the net effect of that, which clearly was not. Why
would they do? Presumably, they had the same Venn diagram that you have. Right. So why do that?
I honestly, to this day, don't know fully what they decided to do and why they decided to do it, and we also don't know who did it in their camp
right.
Who did, and that would very much obviously her camp had to be part of it, because somebody would actually have to confirm it who was in the room. So, or CNN's not going to drop a bombshell like that without somebody in the room confirming it. So obviously their camp had to be a part of it. I can't look. I've always, maybe it's a problem with my media appearances in life, but I've always avoided talking about the motivations of others that I really don't know. And in this case, I really don't know.
Okay. But that's the question, right? Is you had internal polling data, to Sam's point, that indicated that it was more between Biden and Bernie. And for some reason, she felt it was necessary to undercut Bernie and differentiate herself, even though she was, or get some of his support, maybe because she was maxing out with the,
If that was the rationale, it would be a bad idea, because an attack like that, I mean, without any polling data, if there are 10 candidates in the race and candidate B attacks candidate A in the way candidate A loses support, candidate A's supporters are not going to drift to the candidate who just
necessarily right. Yeah, of course. All right. So all right, let me ask you this. In the one other sort of point, how much did the candidate did the campaign hope that Warren sometime before Super Tuesday or after Super Tuesday would endorse Bernie? Because that to me also seemed to be a miscalculation by the Warren campaign, at least insofar as her value was to deliver presumably to Biden or to whomever. Like if she wanted to be vice president, she either endorses Bernie wins, and maybe that helps her getting a vice presidency, or she wants to be Biden's vice president, in which case, had she endorsed Bernie, she would have been able to deliver theoretically Bernie voters.
I tend to agree with your rationale. Bernie voters, our voter base tends not to like her because they see her in both 2016 and 2020 at critical moments not supporting Bernie. I think for us, the important part of her endorsement wasn't so much supporters, but the narrative in the media at, post Super Tuesday was, Biden, all the support of the Democratic Party is gathering around Biden. Everybody's gathering around Biden. And the hope of that endorsement was not that there was a lot of voters that were Elizabeth Warren voters at that point. There just weren't that many voters that were Elizabeth Warren voters. The hope of that endorsement, or that she would sway those voters in one direction or the other, but the kind of national media narrative, which was so important in this race, was Biden's coalescing the entire Democratic Party, everyone's supporting Biden, and an Elizabeth Warren endorsement would have kind of would have been a little bit of a stopper in that narrative. And, in a way that, for example, the Jesse Jackson endorsement before Michigan wasn't, but was important to Bernie on a very personal level and important among the African-American community. It was an important endorsement, but an Elizabeth Warren endorsement would have signified that kind of the political world is not coalescing, and that it didn't happen, was not the best thing for the campaign.
All right, so let me ask you this, and maybe I have two major questions to ask, and let's start with the more negative. Like, from a campaign perspective, at the end of the campaign, was there a sense, and obviously things got complicated because of COVID, although it's arguable as to whether things were 95% over at that point, or 90% over, or 85% over, or 100% over? I mean, it's unclear. But was there any one major strategic decision that you guys on the campaign felt, if we had to make that choice again, we would do it differently?
Look, I think there is a number of people who, I don't think the strategic choices in February and March are the thing you have to look at, right? I think February and March get set up a long time before. Right. And the strategic choice you have to look at, and I go into this in detail in the book, the kind of the scene of it, where prepping for the September debate, Bernie was prepped and Bernie agreed to kind of go on stage and attack Joe Biden. And in the green room before the debate, Faz and I, who were in the green room, saw him change his mind, where to the point where, like, when he walked out of the green room to walk to the stage, I turned to Faz. I was like, do you think he's going to do it? And there was kind of a, and he walked out on stage, and in his opening statement, instead of doing the kind of this attack that we had talked about in prep that he had actually practiced, and he had actually practiced it in the green room before the debate. And I set the scene, and people can read the story in detail about literally what happened, where you saw his mind change. He went out and delivered what I would call the Bernifesto, right? The Medicare for all, college for, like, his popular and good, but not going to make any news and not going to change the format. And so instead of that opening being everyone saying nice things and policy agenda, and then Bernie getting up and basically starting an attack on Joe Biden, it was different. Now, you could argue that attack would have been dangerous and would have created problems, but it also changes the dynamic of the race. And the question is, if you don't, candidates don't typically walk off a cliff, you have to push them. And if you don't, if you left Biden as a credible candidate, we knew from the start of this race that if Super Tuesday was a one-on-one match between Bernie and Biden, Bernie would lose.
Well, I was there. I was at the, the Super Tuesday kind of red wedding situation, and the speech that Bernie gave in the wake of those results, which were very disappointing. And it was shocking to me how aggressively he went after Biden in that speech, by my recollection, in the wake of the Super Tuesday results. So I hope I'm not mixing up which speeches I saw during that election period, because it's all a bit of a haze, but I think that's what it was. So do you perceive that as being a little bit too late when he did go after Biden?
I think once Super Tuesday happens, the Democratic Party wanted a candidate to go up against Trump. And once they saw a candidate emerge on Super Tuesday that was Joe Biden, it wasn't over, but it was going to be very difficult with the system of proportional allocation of delegates and other things to catch up ever. And we knew, and the same thing, we knew if we could come out of Super Tuesday with 150 to 200 delegate lead, it would likely, the only way they could beat Bernie Sanders at that point was by kind of destroying the Democratic Party if he had that lead. Like, they could blow up the party, or they could just have Bernie Sanders as the nominee. But we'd need to get there. And the fact is, if Joe Biden had the delegate lead, it was going to be very, very difficult. It wasn't impossible, but it was going to be very difficult to turn the momentum, because there was such a strong force among the party. And what we saw after South Carolina was $70+ million in free media. This was done by This study was done by the Cantor Media people. $70 million in free media directed at promoting Joe Biden or attacking Bernie Sanders in the 48 hours between South Carolina and Super Tuesday, which is unprecedented.